The theme of this session, ostensibly, was the media and the discussions between science and religion. And so I wanted to actually address some of those issues. So I wear multiple hats in my life, among others, in addition to being a psychologist and researcher. I spend a fair amount of time trying to bring cognitive science outward in various ways. I blog for Psychology Today, for Fast Company. I have a radio show in Austin called Two Guys on Your Head. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about media and how to portray science in the media. And one thing about media is that you have to attract people's attention. So there are different ways of doing that. A show like Two Guys on Your Head, where we just talk about random psychology topics, could only survive on NPR because there's a small number of people who actually just want to sit and hear about stuff. Most media actually thrives, unfortunately, on conflict. That sells airtime in papers and things like that. And of course, in order to get conflict, you have to create polarized groups. And so unfortunately, that gives us, I think, a stilted view of what's going on with most people in their struggles with religious belief and their struggles with spirituality and their struggles with how to balance the variety of beliefs that people have. We talked earlier in the day about the fact that many people have both religious beliefs and scientific beliefs that are partially compatible. This is a struggle a lot of people go through. That is a struggle that doesn't make good television, and so it doesn't get portrayed in the media so much. And yet, I think it's really important for us to begin to engage in real dialogue that begins to uncover some of these issues and to begin to move things away from the debate model, and Conrad was talking about this a little bit as well, that and to kind of piggyback on the discussion as it was just happening in Kelly's talk, I really do think that politics became much more aligned with religion in the United States starting in the late 1960s, and so we have a trend from then forward that has begun to align one political party with more fundamentalist religion, and this was an attempt to build a coalition to break the solid democratic South that had existed since the Civil War. And the politics that are related to that, politics does thrive on polarization, and so that may be fine for politics, but what we have to remember as scientists who are engaged in thinking about religion and in discussing religion is that the fact that there's a lot of politics that are associated with that does not have to govern the way that we engage in discussions. And in particular, what we have to do is to take a step back and ask, what does it mean to actually have a conversation? Conversations don't have to have winners, and that's important because when you have a debate, there has to be a way of winning that debate. Now, science was created specifically to help us to adjudicate hard decisions, because we know as scientists we have very deeply held beliefs. And I want to point out for anyone who has never really engaged with religion themselves before in any deep way, that practicing scientists are not that much different from devout members of religion. We have very deeply held beliefs, and often those deeply held beliefs are held for an awfully long time without evidence. A lot of us work as hard as we do to collect the evidence for the things that we ultimately believe are true, in part because of a faith that we are right about something. So in many ways, what we are doing as scientists is not that much different from what we look at other people who are doing in religious communities. Now, one big difference between science and religion is that we have set a set of rules, for engagement so that pairs of people with diametrically opposed, deeply held beliefs are willing to subject those beliefs to a particular test and ultimately, potentially, agree that one side or the other might be right. Now, the thing is, those debates take place over extraordinarily long periods of time, right? It is not like there's one piece. What happens, right? Somebody runs a study that disagrees with your deeply held belief, and what's the first thing you do? You malign the study, then you malign the researcher, then you wait for a replication, right? Then you find, epicycles that help to preserve as much of your belief as possible. And only, after an extended period of time are you willing to admit that you might be wrong. And now this ought to sound familiar, right? I mean, this is, again, not that much different than what goes on with deeply held religious beliefs. Now, as I say, the one big difference is we are willing to take evidence into account, and so at some point we do get to declare a winner on one side or another. The reason we don't want to engage in that style of discussion when we're engaging with religious communities is because that is not their standard of adjudicating disputes. Now, I want you to bear in mind that religious communities have accepted means for resolving disputes, theological disputes. So I grew up Jewish. If you look at religious discussion in Judaism, you have all sorts of methods that people use to try to adjudicate disputes. The scholar Rashi from the Middle Ages would look for words that that were unnecessary in text. So, because if you think about it, I mean, the Bible was written by somebody, and they weren't thinking about the fact that it was going to be poured over so carefully years later. And so stuff just got written. And then years later, people would say, well, why did they use that word here, but somebody used this word all the way back here? That must mean something. And so that is an accepted method for resolving religious disputes. Now, as scientists, we look at that and go, what? That's not the way we do things. But that doesn't make, but in the context in which it's being done, that is a perfectly reasonable way of resolving a dispute. Now, what does all this mean for us? It means the reason we're not going to engage in a debate in any productive way is because it's not that people in religious communities don't have methods for resolving disputes. It's that those methods don't resemble what we do even a little. And so rather than trying to engage in discussions in which we're ultimately trying to figure out who's better, could you imagine walking around campus trying to figure out what's better, psychology or comparative literature? I mean, I don't know. I'm sure we all have preferences in this, but there is no way of adjudicating that. So instead, the reason for engaging in dialogue is because, darn it, at the end of the day, we might learn something, right? That if I sit down with someone who is engaged in a religious tradition, that I might get insight into the things that I care about. It's not just listening to someone droning on about stuff you don't care about. I care about human behavior by sitting down and talking with people about their beliefs, about their spiritual experiences, about their community, about how their religion, how they believe their religion to influence them. I might learn something in that process. I might actually change elements of the way that I look at the world around me, and by listening and responding in kind, I might actually change other people's beliefs about what it is that cognitive science does. That is the way that we ultimately create consensus. So debate, I think Conrad said this earlier, debate creates polarization, generally speaking. Real conversation actually creates consensus. And the reason for this, and there's plenty of great studies, we've done some work on this in my lab over the years, Simon Garrett has done some stuff on this. The reason that conversation creates consensus is because in order for me to understand what you're saying and to respond to it, in that moment, even if I believe I disagree with you, I have to represent the world exactly the way you did so that I understand what you said. And in that moment of representing the world the way that you did, I have to think like you, which means I leave every conversation, real dialogue, I leave that dialogue thinking more similarly to you than I did when I walked in. And that is a tremendous and powerful way of creating some degree of consensus. And so, I have the privilege of saying the last couple of things here, and then we can open things up for more general questions. But we heard a tremendous amount of really interesting research today. There's a lot of great work that's being done. What I would encourage from here is for us to think about how do we not just see ourselves as trying to spread knowledge about the cognitive science of religion to communities, but how over the next few years we can begin to actually create more of a two-way dialogue with those communities to better understand how it is that we can learn from those communities and how those communities can learn from us, and try to shy away a little bit from the most contentious elements of the debate that is going on. Because from a scientific standpoint in the long run, that's likely to be unproductive. So with that, I'll